Welcome remotely, everyone, from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's National Conservation Training Center in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. My name is Shannon Connors, and I would like to welcome you to the Forest for the Birds Conserving America's Forest Bird webinar series. So before we get into the webinar, I'd just like to remind everyone of a few logistical details. The Forest for the Birds Conserving America's Forest Birds webinar series is jointly sponsored by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's National Conservation Training Center, Forest Ecology Working Group, and the Migratory Bird Program. And we'll share this contact information in the chat box if you're interested in learning more about the Forest Ecology Working Group, or if you'd like to receive continuing education credits for attending these webinars. And just a quick disclaimer, this product is for educational purposes only. The views, opinions, or positions expressed in this webinar series are those of the guest presenter and do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or positions of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Department of the Interior. Some of the materials and images may be protected by copyright or may have been licensed to us by a third party and are restricted in their use. Mention of any product names, companies, web links, textbooks, or other references does not imply federal endorsement. And to introduce Jeff and give us a little bit more information on this webinar series, we have Jeff Horan from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Jeff, welcome, and thanks for being with us here today.
Well, thank you, Shannon, and also thank you to Jim Siegel and the National Conservation Training Center in Shepherdstown, and to our Forest Bird team for all your great assistance. So again, my name is Jeff Horan. I'm a forest ecologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Refuge Program in the North Atlantic Appalachian region. And I'm also with the Forest Ecology Working Group, which worked with partners to create this 12-part webinar series. And I'll be moderating today's webinar and monitoring the chat for questions, as Shannon mentioned. So as I think most of you know, this is a 12-part series called Forest for the Birds. It is jointly sponsored by the Fish and Wildlife Service, Forest Ecology Working Group, and NCTC, along with the Migratory Birds Program. The purpose of our Forest Ecology Working Group and this webinar series is to increase the understanding and integration of forest ecology, applied science, habitat management principles within the Fish and Wildlife Service, and also with our partners. The Migratory Bird Program is pleased to be co-sponsoring the webinar series as part of its Partners in Flight 30-year celebration, and also in recognition of the documented loss of 3 billion birds over the last 50 years. There's still much conservation work to do, and this is part of the roadmap to recovery for forest birds. If you have questions about this webinar series or our Forest Ecology Working Group, my contact information is on the flyer. And for folks needing Wildlife Society or Society of American Foresters continuing education credits, you can contact Jim Siegel for that, and his contact information is also in the flyer. And before I introduce Jeff, I want to mention a few things. As Shannon mentioned, we'll be trying to engage you, the participants, by taking a few questions during the course of the presentation. And we'll do that after about 20 minutes, and then again at the end of Jeff's presentation. At each point, I'll select a question or two from the chat for Jeff to answer. In the next few days, Jeff will also try to answer any additional questions that were in the chat, and we'll send those back to you. And then just one more thing before I introduce Jeff, I want to run a quick commercial for our webinar number 6, which is August 17th, and that is stand level management, desired forest conditions, structure and composition, and our speaker will be Randy Wilson from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So now to introduce Dr. Jeffrey Larkin. He is a distinguished professor of wildlife ecology and conservation at Indiana University of Pennsylvania. He earned his BA in biology from Ithaca College and MS in forestry and PhD in animal sciences from the University of Kentucky. His research often combines his expertise in forestry, wildlife ecology, and conservation practice. Jeff works closely with the USDA's Natural Resource Conservation Service to deliver conservation programs that benefit forests, forest birds, and forest owners. Lastly, he serves as the American Bird Conservancy's Eastern Birds Forest Habitat Advisor, which also enables him to serve as a science advisor for NRCS's Working Lands for Wildlife Partnerships. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Jeffrey Larkin. And again, we're going to be talking about the habitat matrix and this key role of stepping down bird management from landscape to stand. Okay, Jeff, tell us some bird stories. Thank you.
Certainly a pleasure to have been invited to participate in this webinar series. I think the first four have been great, and I'm really looking forward to listening to the rest of the webinars that will occur after mine. Today, we're going to be talking about kind of, I guess, putting science into practice and understanding the role that foresters and forest managers play in really helping us recover forest birds. I guess the first thing we should do here is kind of have a little bit of terminology on scale. So we should think a little bit about the word stand and what stands implies, because the title suggests that we're scaling down to a stand, but really we have to be thinking about stands as a collective. Stands serving as the matrix to the landscape in which we are trying to improve for forest birds. So I just have an example here. So we have a state game lands in Pennsylvania. It's about 27,000 acres. Forest managers in charge of being the stewards of this land might divide this into 3 different compartments. And of course, those compartments are further delineated into stands, what you see here within the boundaries of the game lands in those compartments. And of course, it's within those stands that management decisions are made, right? And it's this kind of focus that public land managers take across larger spatial extents. But when we're thinking about recovering birds, we have to be thinking about public lands as well as private lands. And we need to be thinking about how stands really comprise the entire matrix in which we're working in. And of course, some of these places are easier to work. Some of these places you can cover with much fewer conversations with fewer individuals, and other activities to recover birds will require conversations with a great many individuals. So a little bit of a roadmap, if you will, of today's talk. First, I'm going to give you a little bit of a background. If you think about the backdrop of forest bird conservation, so eastern forests, past and present, if you will. And then we're going to move on to eastern forest bird ecology. Essentially, what is the science telling us that birds need in order to be successful? Third, we're going to move on to the role of forestry and forest stewardship. So I think this one we could have changed this one, and I was stuck on which title to use, but it could be help a forester help you, or make friends with a forester. And then we might want to say make friends with foresters, plural, because we need their help. We need a lot of their help. And finally, I would like to provide a little bit of and it will be quite brief, a little bit of a case studies, if you will, of how we're working to make the matrix more dynamic here in Pennsylvania. And of course, how we hope that that is advanced to other states that are working to reverse the decline of forest birds. And really that will cover understanding the dynamics, if you will, or the synergy that can be created between public and private landowners. So this is the world that I mostly work in, although I think that much of what I have to say is applicable to eastern forests in general. But I find myself working most of the time in the Appalachian forest, the central and southern Appalachian forest to be more specific. And that BCR 28, of course, is quite heavily forested. About 70% of BCR 28 is forested, in fact. And forests, of course, bring out lots of emotions and a lot of people and stewardship, philosophies, of course, and decisions are all socially driven just as much as they are ecologically driven. It's because forests are important to us, right? They're an important part of our natural heritage. They're an important part of rural economies. And for those reasons, a lot of folks have these different opinions of how we should manage forests. And I'm going to try to present an opinion in the context of what forest birds are telling us. So eastern deciduous forests, quite diverse. And we can think about eastern deciduous forest diversity from a species-specific perspective, or we can be thinking about it from a community or ecosystem perspective. The levels of biodiversity in our eastern forests are immense. And unfortunately, as we all very well know, the threats to our eastern deciduous forests are just as immense, whether it be invasive species, deer that are out of balance with local landscapes, diseases, conversion and fragmentation and parcelization of forests, and of course, on private lands, unsustainable harvests. And all of that works to reduce biodiversity, whether it be at an ecosystem, community, or species scale, and certainly the genetic scale as well. So the cumulative impacts of all of those threats is not just the loss of biodiversity, but it's a lack of economic opportunities that might come from a lack of desired regeneration, degradation of water quality, and of course, reduced recreational opportunities, or at least the quality of experiences. And that may be, whether you're a bird watcher or a bird hunter, those experiences are impacted by these threats. And I like to think about these threats in occurring in over three periods of time, if you will. We can think about the threats to our forests from a perspective of ghosts from forest pasts, that being the landscape scale clearing that occurred well before any of us were around, the ghosts of forest present, those things that much of us spend an awful lot of time thinking about and trying to mitigate. And then, of course, we need to be mindful of the ghosts of forest future. And these are the things that keep some of us or many of us up at night wondering what it's going to be. We know that certainly climate change plays a role in that, but it seems as though every other day there is a new threat to our forests. And being good stewards of our forests is important for mitigating all of these time series threats. I think we can all agree on one thing, and that is that we need to keep forests on the landscape if we want to do good things for forest birds. So we need to continue to convince society that forests are important, right? Mitigating climate change, protecting our water's quality, recreational opportunities, rural and economic opportunities. So we need to keep forests on the landscape, and we have, over the long term, done a pretty good job at recovering our forests, given where we were long ago. This is a graph from Pennsylvania, one of the more recent Pennsylvania state action plans. And you can see here that certainly we're nowhere near the approximately 28 million acres of forest that once occupied our state. But you can see that we are sitting somewhere around the 17 million acre mark now. And we can see that that has continued to edge up ever so slightly since the early 2000s. So good things there. That's some good news. But step two, no matter how much forest we put on the landscape, how much we protect through easements or public ownership, we have to recognize that we have to be good stewards of that forest. And good stewardship is an action. It is an activity. It is not something that is passive. The threats that face our forests disallow passive stewardship in many cases. Stewardship looks like any one of these activities that you see in these photos. And sometimes it's not pretty. We look at this particular picture, and to the untrained eye, someone would say, look at that nice older forest. It's got this lush understory. But to those of us who have trained eyes, we see this as an outcome of a bygone era or maybe present era where deer were out of balance with our local landscape. And it might need to be dealt with quite aggressively, maybe through an herbicide application, which could be unsightly at first. But when we see the product of that activity some years after that treatment, and we see here to the right, what we have is a more resilient forest, a forest that's likely to become an oak forest again in the light of some damage to the canopy. And it could be activities as light as a shelter wood, which are good for certain species. And of course, we know that eventually a shelter would have some more of the canopy removed. And of course, that would be good for another suite of species across these landscapes. All of these activities working as a collective make our forests more diverse. So we must become better stewards of our forests. And it's expensive, and it's technically challenging, and it's, of course, not easy. And it's going to be dependent upon strong partnerships and a strong desire to make the changes to the landscapes that we need to make. Eastern forest birds are one of those wildlife groups that are telling us that we must do better. This is not just me telling us that we must do better. Eastern forest birds have been telling us for a while that we need to do better. We go back to the 2009 State of the Birds report, you see that the Eastern Forest Bird Group was certainly not doing as well as the other two forest groups. And then we can advance a little bit more recent in time to the Rosenberg paper in 2019, the 3 billion birds lost, whereby 170 million Eastern forest birds have been lost in the last 50 years. 6 in 10 wood thrush have been lost from our landscapes. Certainly, it doesn't take you long to dig into the literature before you realize that there has been a lot of work done, a lot of research that's been done on forest birds, and much of that research has focused on relationships of forest birds or forest bird communities with the habitat, the forest structure composition. And one thing that is quite clear from all of this is that landscape context is important. How much forest cover do we have on our landscapes? What type of forest do we have comprising those forest landscapes? Mixed oak forest, northern hardwood forest, aspen forest. What is the age class interspersion of that forest? And then the other thing that the science has overwhelmingly showed us is that structural complexity of vegetation is important. All of these pictures on the right are examples of forest structure. Forest structure needs to be diverse. If we want to have diverse bird communities, if we want to recover diverse bird communities, then we need to be managing. We need to be stewards of diverse conditions in our forests. So why are forest birds in trouble? So I would argue that our forest birds are in trouble because our forests are too simple. And now many forest-dependent species are paying for it. In one mass sweep across our eastern landscape, we lost thousands of years of structural diversity and complexity in the making. And as I said earlier, we're fortunate to have forest back on much of our landscapes, or large portions of our landscapes. But unfortunately, much of this forest came back at the same time. So it's quite similar in structure, and it's certainly not very old. We should be clear on that. Even though this looks like what we would call a mature forest, it's arguably not mature. It may have mature trees on it, but it certainly is not a mature forest. In fact, here is what an age class distribution looks like for our forests in Pennsylvania. And if you look at the forest age class distribution for any of your eastern states, you'd see quite a similar graph, I assure you. You can see that we don't have a whole lot on the bookends, and certainly on the top there, greater than 161, we could go many more bars above that, right? But for space reasons, we cut it off at 161. And you can see that it's no surprise that those species that are most imperiled in our eastern forest are those that are linked to those bookend age classes. Certainly, we need to balance our age classes. We need to get a little bit of this middle-aged forest back into the younger forest and let a whole lot of that advance into older age classes. You say, oh, wait a minute, what about wood thrush? 6 in 10 have been lost in the last 50 years, but we have plenty of this mature forest on the landscape that wood thrush are usually associated with. What's going on with that? Well, we have to go back to our ghosts of forest present, right? We have to be thinking about what's happening in those mature forests. Think about unsustainable timber harvests, all of the invasive species that plague our forests, and of course, regions that have deer that are out of balance with the local landscape. All of these factors, despite all of that forest on our landscape, reduce the structural complexity of our forests. AKA it reduces the number of niches that are out there for forest birds. That's not it though. We need to think a whole lot more about full breeding season habitat needs of forest birds. All of that, many of those studies I mentioned that have been done on forest birds and forest habitat relationships are studies that are the product of monitoring that occurs during the nesting season, if you will. We have to understand and appreciate that it's not just about nests and nestlings, that these birds are with us for a little bit longer beyond that nesting season. And of course, making sure that we meet the needs of birds during the non-nesting season, we'll call it the post-fledging period, and pre-migration even, is really important. And forest birds are telling us this. In more recent years, decades, we've had studies that have been able to look at the post-fledging ecology and survival of songbirds and forest birds. For example, Cam Fiss's work on golden-winged warblers in Pennsylvania, over 100 fledglings tracked. After leaving the nest, we see that this bird hatched out of an egg that was in a nest in a 4-year-old overstory removal, which was adjacent to a 4-year-old shelterwood harvest, which was adjacent to a 20-year-old overstory removal. After gaining some mobility, after leaving the nest, over the next 30 days, it moved into that 20-year-old overstory removal. But before then, entering into that 4-year-old shelterwood. And this bird, best we know at that point, of course, reached its independence and hopefully continued to grow and made its way down to South America. Work by Doug Raybuck, also in Pennsylvania, up in the ANF, on cerulean warbler, showed a very, very similar pattern for post-fledging behaviors and habitat selection of cerulean warblers, whereby they went across this forest landscape and their decisions were quite dynamic, right? Dynamic choices during that post-fledging period. These two imperiled eastern forest birds use places that are quite different from where they place their nests. And we need to make sure that we understand that that 30-day post-fledging period, when these species are trying to do everything they need to do to wrap up their reproductive season, to make sure that they best ensure their young are successful and get a chance to migrate to their wintering grounds. So we need to be thinking about how we manage for these species beyond nesting habitat. So those two studies showed quite an interesting picture of what we need to be thinking about in our eastern forests if we're wanting to conserve golden-winged warblers and manage for golden-winged warbler breeding, full breeding season needs, as well as cerulean warblers. And they're quite a bit beyond the scale of a stand, right? We need to be thinking about those stands that are surrounding this particular stand. So take home point number one, a mosaic of forest habitat conditions achieved through forest management activities within forested landscapes will benefit juveniles as they develop, molt, and prepare for their first migration. And it's not just those two species. One of the classics back in 1998 of post-fledging and juvenile dispersal work on wood thrush had a quote in there. Our data suggests that in large tracts of mature deciduous forest, a mosaic of early and mid-successional forests, along with mature riparian forests, will accommodate both breeding and post-dispersal habitat requirements of wood thrush. Another study out of Dave King's lab at the University of Massachusetts, more recently, looked at different landscapes with respect to wood thrush productivity and other demographics. And what it found was that there were no difference in nest success, fecundity, and post-fledging survival between these two landscape types. One more heavily managed for early succession or young forest conditions or shrubland conditions than the other. Abundance of breeders was greater on landscapes that had more early successional habitat. So what does all that mean? from a picture perspective, it means this. And what does it mean from recovering wood thrush populations? It means that those adults, given that fecundity, right, reproductive output was equal, produced that many young. And of course, these individuals would have produced far more young. The list goes on. I'm going to show one more here for whippoorwill. Forest management for whippoorwills should consider harvest strategies that maintain the availability of regenerating patches in close proximity of mature forests. Similar studies have been done for hooded warblers and ovenbirds, worm-eating warblers, scarlet tanagers, to say a few. And of course, it's not just birds. Native pollinators, bats, mesocarnivores. These papers all are out there. They all, almost all of them, end with a concluding paragraph that sounds something like this. This is one from the bats. However, it is apparent that from a number of studies that these three species may benefit from heterogeneous forest landscapes such as those created by active forest management, when heterogeneity encompasses forest type, age, and structural characteristics. So you think about it, it's kind of a paradox that lies before us here. Very similar to the famous saying or quote from Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, water, water everywhere, but not a drop to drink. I say there are a fair number of forest birds, eastern forest birds, that would probably, if they could speak to you, they would probably paraphrase and rephrase that particular quote and have it sound something like forest, forest everywhere, but not a place to nest or raise my young, or perhaps nest and raise my young. I'll stop for a moment, take a few or a question or two if the second one is short, just kind of show you this video to entertain you. It's a video of one of Camphis's fledglings being taught how to forage by its adult. And it'd be really cool if you could hear the background, because the background in here are forest birds singing, eastern wood mature forest nesting birds, I should say, eastern wood peewees, American redstarts, ovenbirds, and others. But anyway, Dad's showing kid how to forage here. Jeff, I'll take some questions.
So right. So you folks can enter questions into you can enter questions into the chat, but there are a couple questions there, and the first question I see, and I do think it's pretty relevant to how you laid things out, is from Sharon, and she's talking about your ghosts of forest past. So her question is basically, many people have the idea that forests were old growth before it was cut in the 1800s, and that's what all forests now should be managed for. Can you speak to that? What did the forest look like back in the 1600s, and how does that play into how we manage them today? Again, you spoke to some of that, Jeff, but you really didn't talk about the structure and the components of that existing forest.
Well, certainly I wasn't back there in the 1600s, and the best we can do to answer this question would be to think about the state of those forests and some of the things that have happened to our current forests. First of all, they probably were not all old growth, certainly not. The evidence suggests that they weren't. There was a lot of other activities occurring on the landscape by native peoples, for sure. You also had trees that were quite old, right? Trees actually would reach an age across not just individual trees, but groups of individual trees across the landscape would have died within that forest matrix. And then, of course, other disturbance events would have occurred, windstorms across landscapes, wildfires. You had a lot of old trees, there's no doubt about it. But you would have also had old trees more adjacent to younger forest patches. Think about what a characteristic kind of forest landscape that's been left to diversify over thousands of years would have looked like. Certainly they would have not looked like much of the forest that we have on the landscape today. Our forests are really young from a forest age perspective.
Hey, thanks, Jeff. So there is a second question here that I know you can answer pretty quickly, I believe. So I'll go ahead and let you take that one. So it's how large are the habitat patches on the golden wing and cerulean warbler slides where you had the 4-year canopy overstory removal and the 20-year-old overstory removal? So it's just how large were those patches in general?
Those patches, I'm going to go off just a kind of a guess on memory here. That overstory removal was probably somewhere around 40 to 50 acres. Shelterwood slightly smaller, and that clear cut would have been about the size of that shelterwood. I don't have the image in front of me, but I'm fairly certain that that 4-year-old overstory removal was approximately 40 to 50 acres.
Thanks.
So we're talking about an overstory removal that would have supported several golden wing warbler pairs, and in fact it did.
No, perfect. Thank you. Back to it.
Sure. Yep. All right. So lucky for us, it's not just about forest birds or wildlife. Addressing threats and balancing age classes are not only important to forest birds, but they're also important to foresters and forest managers. Every state has a forest action plan. Many of you are probably familiar with wildlife action plans. I hope if you have an interest in forest bird conservation, you will find the forest action plan at this website for those states that you work in. And the best thing you can do for forest birds is to read your state's forest action plan, understand what the strategies are that lie within those plans, and figure out how best you can help foresters execute that strategy. What's good for the forest is good for forest birds. I have no doubt about that. Foresters are trained to manage forests sustainably. Foresters. And we need to remember that there's a difference between foresters and loggers. And when foresters on the job, sustainably managing forests can be a reality. It's a reality when we give foresters the tools they need to use in order to manage sustainably. And those tools that they need to use to manage sustainably are tools that allow them to work against those various ghosts, right? Let them have the tools required to do forest stand improvements. Those might be things like mechanical low shade removals, that herbicide application might be prescribed fire. It could be commercial harvest, right? Whether it be something along the continuum of the shelterwood sequence or an overstory removal if conditions are proper. And then, of course, tending those forests after they have been harvested via crop tree releases or similar methods. This takes money, and not just a little bit of money, but a lot of money. Forest stewardship is expensive, but the outcomes are worth it. Like this young forest with residual oaks, with all sorts of oak regeneration in the understory. Or perhaps stewardship that resulted in a mature forest stand that may never, ever be harvested, but for which a nice lush growth of oak seedlings inhabits the understory. This forest is more resilient for that activity. For forest birds, inaction is not a solution. We cannot sit by and do nothing. And I recommend the Shifley paper 2014 that you see cited there. I recommend all of you take a look at that, read it, embrace it. One of the quotes from that paper, forests will uniformly grow old without management intervention. And that, sounds great, growing old without intervention. But I ask you, something like a cerulean warbler that has showed this population trend over the last 40 years, it needs that old growth conditions, right? Those late successional conditions, dynamic forests, canopy gaps, and the like. Does it have time? Does that population, the remaining number of individuals, does that have time to wait for our forest to grow old and structurally diverse on their own? Same for the golden wing warbler. Does it have time for ample amounts of young forest habitat to be placed on the landscape via Mother Nature? I think they would argue not. The science-derived evidence for forest bird population trends and species habitat relationships demonstrate that conserving and recovering these species and many others will require stewardship. Simply setting aside forest is not going to be good enough. So how do we do this? So we got a couple of places. We think about the Eastern Forest Bird Conservation Canvas, if you will. We have two main areas that we can focus our attention: private forests and public forests. I want to take a few minutes just to kind of go over some of the work that we've been doing on both of these in both of these areas to help recover forest birds. The first is going to be working lands for wildlife. We're going to look at the importance of private forests on our eastern landscape. Undeniable. We cannot work on public forests alone if we think we're going to make any kind of a difference to the recovery of forest birds. Private forest landowners and their partners play a huge role in recovering bird populations. And there are a lot of those landowners out there. I just threw a couple of the states and the state action plans, forest action plans, a couple of statistics there. Pennsylvania, 497,000 non-industrial private forest owners, 130,000 in Maryland, and greater than 300,000 in North Carolina. That's a lot of landowners to be interacting with, and many of them don't own huge parcels. So it requires interacting with a great number of private landowners if we're going to make a difference for reversing forest bird declines. We have to help them because it is a costly and technically challenging conservation action, right? All of those threats that face private forests, whether it be the lure of money through unsustainable practices, or all of those other things that we've talked about a few times already in this webinar. And the work that needs to be done to sustainably manage forests, whether it be public and private, takes years. Takes years for these practices to develop before one can move on to the next step in the recipe for success. Forest birds are really lucky in the East. They're lucky that NRCS came to the aid back in 2012 with Working Lands for Wildlife and a similar program with RCPP in more recent years. Working Lands for Wildlife provides win-win solutions for wildlife, forests, and forest landowners and producers. Again, it began in 2012, and it provides much needed financial and technical assistance funds to private landowners. And it allows us to help landowners manage their forest and create habitat. And in this case, for the golden wing warbler, the golden wing warbler being one of the target species for Working Lands for Wildlife 1.0. So one of the national level species. Many of you may be familiar with Working Lands for Wildlife 2.0 that has other state level or smaller regional level species, target species. And of course, there's a golden wing warbler strategy for Working Lands for Wildlife across this landscape. And ultimately, the funds that come from Working Lands for Wildlife provide both technical assistance for partners to work with NRCS field offices to help landowners navigate that process. And then, of course, to pay for the practices that need to be done on these lands. And it's a process, right? It's a process that starts with a conversation, data collection on what the forest conditions are like, marking boundaries if a project is selected for funding, working with contractors and forest landowners to make sure that projects are done according to plan, and then, of course, certifying that the projects have been completed to the satisfaction of the plan. From 2012 to present, NRCS and its partners worked with 450 landowners across 10 states to create golden wing warbler habitat on approximately 30,000 acres. And that resulted in $14.4 million in financial assistance to private landowners across that geography. In the mid 2014-15, the cerulean warbler RCPP was unrolled, and that went for 4 years. And another 244 landowners interacted with across 3 states. West Virginia, I left off. Apologies to West Virginia folks on that text in the bottom right. 244 landowners totaling 8,932 acres, about $3.5 million in financial assistance. Folks, that's nearly $20 million over the last decade that NRCS has obligated to landowners to help fix forests, to help recover target bird species. NRCS also, through the Conservation Effects Assessment Project, funded research to examine the outcomes of working lands for wildlife. And without getting into too much detail there, we found that about 25% of sites became occupied by golden-winged warblers by the final year of monitoring. And the things that were most important at the analysis level for occupancy was the number of growing seasons. It takes time for the conditions to develop that are attractive to golden-winged warblers. And at the landscape, deciduous forest landscape over mixed forest landscape. We also found that distance to a known golden-winged warbler population was really important, whereby 99.9% of all of our occupied sites were less than 8.5 miles from a known golden-winged warbler population. So we use that monitoring results to inform future program delivery. To take that landscape context and the distance to golden-winged warblers to develop what we call priority areas for conservation. And those areas are the areas in which landowners that are within the yellow shaded boundary there, if they apply for the program, and say a landowner in the brown area of the otherwise eligibility area applies, the landowner, if there's only a nickel to give out, the landowner that's in the yellow shaded area is going to be the higher priority for those fundings. We want to make sure that we improve the success of the program, and we do that by targeting conservation, and that comes from the science that results from the monitoring. One thing we have to keep in mind, though, is that working lands for wildlife projects are diffuse across the landscape, both in space and time, right? So even if we create a pack, and think about this landowner that might enroll over here in 2013, and another landowner that might enroll over here in 2021. Certainly, we're thinking about the succession that occurs on that young forest habitat over time, and how that can be out of sync with neighboring lands. And really, when you look at how much of that 40,000 acres across BCR 28, 70 million acres of forests, nearly $20 million, folks, and we affected 0.05% of BCR forests. It's not that these places that we worked in are not important, because any site that has that's occupied by a cerulean warbler or a golden-winged warbler, the current status of those species are important. But what we need to do is make sure that we further increase the value of those private lands by thinking about them in the context of public land partnerships. They might not be as numerous on the landscape as private lands, but public land acres are certainly important. They provide core areas, right? Larger contiguous forest blocks made up of many, many, many stands. These areas usually employ agency foresters. They often have existing forest management plans, and they usually have a base annual budget to implement projects identified in their forest management plans. They can do planning across their local landscapes. But keep in mind, the public forests are generally understaffed, struggle to balance planning and implementation, and never have the funds to implement all the projects within a forest management plan in the timelines identified in the forest management plan. Public forests can serve as anchor points for sustained landscape scale bird conservation and can be very important to helping us ensure that private land sites enrolled in conservation programs like RCPP or Working Lands for Wildlife have the greatest chance of becoming occupied by target species. Forest management within this particular public land in this landscape for golden wing warbler with existing golden wing warbler will bolster those golden wing warbler populations on that public land and also provide a source to be within 8.5 miles of all of these private lands that lie in proximity to this public land. And we know we're having success when we're able to extend the priority area for conservation boundaries. When we start to find golden wing warbler populations in other parts of the landscape, we know that we're making progress. We're really fortunate that National Fish and Wildlife Foundation and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and many of their partners contribute funds for programs like the Delaware Watershed Conservation Fund, as well as the Central Appalachian Stewardship Program. These provide much needed dollars to manage for dynamic forest landscapes. Here in Pennsylvania, the Dynamic Forest Partnership was started back in 2016. It was really our partners that have been working together since really the mid-2000s, advancing or evolving as a partnership beyond what we had previously referred to ourselves as the Young Forest Partnership, and embracing the opportunity to work at all forest age classes, to balance forest age classes, to recover diverse forest bird communities. Some of our most active partners in the partnership are provided, their logos are provided at the bottom. We have been able to successfully gain $1.6 million in conservation funding since 2017, and that doesn't include the 1.6 in required matching. And I'm happy to say that the vast majority of that funding goes toward implementation. It goes to making changes on landscapes, executing forest management plans, and it all starts with a plan, right? It all starts with a comprehensive dynamic forest restoration block plan, where we have this general goal here within any of our dynamic forest blocks to manage for young forest, mixed aged forest, and late cereal stage forest, and to manage for those ratios that you see. And it's going to depend on landscape context as to where exactly we are in those 35 to 50% categories down here in the bottom right corner. And it takes time. It's not all done with a wave of a magic wand, no matter how much money we have provided to us in the immediate term. This is two different maps, one for current forest conditions in 2020, and the other where we want this forest to be in the next 15 years. And you can see here that the work we have planned for implementing on this landscape will increase that young age class. We'll see a decrease, right, in this 40 to 80-year-old from 43% to 1.4. Don't gasp at home. It's not because it's all being lost and converted. It's because much of it's going on to the next age class. This work of diversifying, balancing age classes is not something that happens even in 15 years. We got ourselves into this problem for a while now, for many, many years of inactivity or budgets that did not allow us to fix the landscape to the extent that we do. And look, even after 15 years, we still do not have greater than 125-year-old forest on the landscape. A bunch of that 92% is going to be advancing in the next 15 years. And we're going to have those other younger age classes populated with more acres as well. And then the key is to perpetually manage for that age class distribution. Monitoring is important. It's generally a hypothesis based on a bunch of single species results that what's going to be good in a dynamic forest context is going to be good for our forest bird communities. And we monitor the heck out of these dynamic forest blocks. Over 2,218 points have been monitored since 2018 across our 15 dynamic forest block landscapes. That accounts for 180,000 acres under dynamic forest block management. And we take advantage of advances, becoming more efficient and comprehensive in our monitoring, and where we recently, in the last 2 years, deployed 800 ARUs across some of the points on these dynamic forest blocks. And we're going to continue to implement. Moving forward, we're going to implement some more. We're going to monitor some more. We're going to learn from that monitoring, and we're going to implement some more, that adaptive management, and we're going to educate and we're going to share. That's the goals of the Dynamic Forest Partnership. And I think that if we do that, we reach out to both public lands and private lands and focus our efforts to make sure that there's synergy, so that these aren't just random acts of kindness spread across the landscape, but landscape scale management that is done with purpose. And that purpose is to recover forest bird populations. And to do that, we must listen to what the forest birds are telling us that we need to do and manage for full breeding season habitat needs. And finally, my last slide, we have to be patient. This population response to habitat creation or enhancement is a marathon. It's not a sprint. The marathon got our landscapes into this current condition, and it's going to be a marathon to correct it. But we should look at the successes that we have had in recent decades when habitat restoration has been attempted and sustained. We're provided with great examples of these species or groups of species that have recovered when partnerships have weathered the storm over time, listened to the science, and created the habitat conditions that these species need. And we don't know where exactly it is for forest birds, but I leave you with much optimism. I think we have a great opportunity with the resources that are being made available to us, the advances in science and planning and GIS, that we're going to be able to demonstrate that we can create dynamic forests and we can recover dynamic forest bird populations in the process. And I thank you all for your attention today. Thanks for sitting by your computer, especially in the middle of the summer when I know many of you would probably rather be out enjoying some field work or wherever that might bring you, maybe a beach in some faraway cool place as well. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. And my email is at the bottom of the screen, and happy to take any questions that folks might have at this time.
Hey, Jeff. So that was a great presentation. So I really appreciate that. And again, you took us a long way to have to take us from the landscape down to the stand and really explain the context in each place. So there are some good questions in the chats. And some of them are very detailed. And so I'm going to summarize this one. And it's really about looking at natural disturbance versus, and how we might mimic natural disturbance. And it's complicated because it's talking about fire and it's talking about the 2012 planning rule that impacts national forests. But at any rate, so I'm going to read you a piece of this, and it's kind of unfair because you're not going to have the full context, but I think you're going to get the gist from this. So it says fires burn mature, intermediate age, and young forests, creating heterogeneity across scales. And I'm going to say they modeled this, and so this is based on some modeling efforts. And then forest management, in contrast, tended to treat mature and old forest and tended not to alter early and mid-seral as much, only through thinning. And so here's the real suggestion. And Kevin's basically saying, I think we need better descriptions of structure, function, composition, and connectivity for our systems at multiple scales in order to better understand how to make forest management more similar to natural disturbances. Do you have, so on that piece, what do you think? And again, your last slide, a couple slides back, kind of, led right to that.
Yes, we need to think about those detailed within stand or across stand structural questions. the reality is that we are trying to fix the forest for the first time in the history of the forest being messed up, right? So we should not assume that we know everything that we need to know with respect to how best to go about this process. Certainly, forests were influenced, forest structure and composition was influenced by fire. I'm not quite sure where and maybe again, you said it was a simulation, but certainly we do a fair bit of prescribed burning here in Pennsylvania and within our dynamic forest blocks. And we certainly see a response of forest birds to activities that result from, structure that results from prescribed fire. But we need to keep in mind, first and foremost, that we need to act on creating dynamic forest landscapes in the present. How we do that is, especially in the present, is going to be through the use of every tool in the toolbox. Fire, forest management. If we can demonstrate that birds are responding, in a nice paper from DJ's work on golden wing warblers and looking at their occupancy in timber harvest versus adjacent shrub wetland communities in the Poconos demonstrated this, that you can increase. Nesting success was high, occupancy was just as high. You can increase local populations of declining birds through forest management, commercial timber harvest, for example. There's a great number of places in that same landscape that resulted from, we don't necessarily want these, but there was about an 8,000 acre wildfire that burned through that landscape and affected a great portion of the canopy. There are lots of golden wing warblers there right now. And certainly that kind of phenomenon occurred across our landscapes historically. And of course, species assemblages responded to those kinds of activities. I certainly don't have an answer as to what's better than the other at this point in time. I just know that we need to do more, and that forests can be managed through prescribed fire as well as commercial timber harvests. And it's going to take some of that commercial activity to get us the money we need to be able to continue the stewardship activities that we want to do on non-commercial lands as well.
So thanks. So that was, again, it was a complex question, and we'll save these from the chat, and you can, and if you have a chance, Jeff, to take a shot at these, then we'll send them back to folks. But I also,
that last question, by the way, was more of a dissertation type of a question. So
and when you see, and Kevin laid it out. I mean, he laid it out. I mean, so at any rate, and we're at 2:00. But I will say, if folks want to stay for a few minutes, Jeff had said he could stay for a couple minutes for a couple more questions. So at any rate, so I'm going to hit this is along that same kind of line. So there's a number of folks that talked about the social license for foresters to operate at different scales. And also there was also a similar conversation along the same line, but it talked about, forest carbon related issues, so carbon storage versus cutting the forest, and those kind of issues. And then Carl asked very specifically, and again, through some of your slides, you were kind of saying, forest management is the answer, foresters are the answer. And so these are all along that line. So Carl asked very simply, there are many people within public agencies, including the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, who are against active forest management. So assuming Jeff, that you're saying, hey, we need to do forest management, how do you propose changing the antagonistic view of much of the public to these kinds of activities, which, as we know, aren't always pretty on the landscape?
Through the science, it's quite simple. If you want to recover forest birds, the science to date is very clear that forest birds need diverse conditions. And if you want to prevent those birds from going extinct, then you need to create those conditions within the time frame that disallows them from going extinct. And that's going to be through active forest management. Make no mistake about it. Now, a great number of acres are going to continue down the trajectory of becoming old on their own, but there needs to be some stopgap measures that are taken into account now, currently, that allows us to keep these species on the landscape while the lion's share of those acres of forest do become older on their own. It's too costly, and quite simply, I don't often have too much time for the argument that, you know, active forest management is going to destroy everything. You saw the amount of money that was spent to create habitat for two target species, and we affected like 0.05. That's already multiplied by 100 to get to the percent. We don't have to worry about affecting our public forests to the extent that some people worry. I would turn the table on questions like that, and I would say that if you are seriously concerned about active forest management, there is one active forest management activity that you really need to spend the rest of your career working on, and that's high grading on private lands. High grading is affecting tens and tens of thousands of acres across eastern forest landscapes, private landscapes every year, and it is diminishing the quality of those forests, the structure of those forests, the species compositions of those forests. There's where folks need to spend their time worrying about active forest management and the bad things that can come from that. Now, if we look at game lands, for example, in Pennsylvania Game Commission manages about 1.5 million acres of game lands. Fully 750,000 acres of that 1.5 million acres is inoperable land. That's not land that's ever going to be managed to remove the canopy. We're going to have plenty of older forests to become old on its own. And the species ecology and their population trends are telling us that inaction is not an option.
So that's a great point. I know, Jeff, when I did Maryland State Forest Management Plan for their 200,000 acres of forest, fully half of that was completely offline for any management, completely offline. So oftentimes that's kind of the baseline where you're starting. But it's, but it's a public issue, people, and the public needs to have a say. The public does need to have a say in that. So here's a simpler question. Here's a very simply asked question, Jeff, but of course the answer is not simple. So simply, as you open the forest canopy, are you having increasing invasive plants establishing?
Sometimes yes, sometimes no, but that's part of the forest management planning. No forester worth the salt would do forest management without making sure there was a plan in place to counter invasive species. And of course, those invasive species, if contended with quickly and effectively, canopy closure occurs on these landscapes pretty quickly, and that threat is minimized. So yeah, in some places, certainly there is increased risk of invasive species. In some places, we don't see it, but you can bet that the partnership that I work within, we plan forest management. It's not that active forest management, something that affects the canopy, is done and then you walk away from that stand forever. That stand needs to be tended. So doing this work responsibly is not an inexpensive and from a monetary or time perspective.
Excellent. So some other things in the chat, Jeff, were, hey, great presentation. So that's so thanks to all our participants. We had around, I think the biggest number I saw was around 408 folks. So thanks to everyone who joined us, and thank you, Jeff Larkin. That was really a great presentation. And I will say, remind folks one more time, that on August 17th, we're going to have stand level management, desired forest conditions, and structure and composition. So exactly where Jeff left us off. He took us into the stands and talked about this, but we're going to get right down into it the next time. I'll also remind folks that if you need Wildlife Society or Society of American Foresters credits, you can email either myself or Jim Siegel, and our contact information is on the flyer. So that's great. And thanks to everyone, and especially thanks to Jeff Larkin for a great presentation.
Thank you. And I
Bye,
see
everyone.
lots of chats in there directed toward me. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. And of course, you can always email me as well. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Hey, Jeff, thanks so much.